So at this point, I'm going to introduce Kaila. She comes to us from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, located in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba. And so the NCTR is the home of all the documents, photographs, and statements collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Kaila is the Supervisor of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming. In her role, she oversees matters related to the support of educators, the development of resources, establishment of outreach initiatives, as well as public engagement on residential schools and their legacy. Prior to the NCTR, Kaila worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a statement gatherer and a coordinator to support statement gathering activities. She holds a BA in Criminal Justice from the University of Winnipeg and a Master's in International Crimes and Criminology from a university in Amsterdam that I'm not going to try to pronounce. So maybe you can start off by pronouncing that for us, Kaila. But welcome, Kaila. We're really excited about having you here and to share your talk with us.
Wonderful, and thanks for having me. And just to touch on that, it's called Vrij Universiteit, and it just means the Free University of Amsterdam. So just knowing I have more content than time, I'm going to move right into the start of my presentation and just provide a little bit more of an introduction about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm an intergenerational survivor. So what that means is my mother attended residential school, her siblings, her parents, and extended family also attended residential school, both in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And just as a note, I am speaking from Treaty 1 territory, so the traditional lands of the Cree, Oji Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and homeland of the Métis. And it's important that I also make mention that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake First Nation, of which just a couple days ago, the road that allowed access into the community now has a water treatment center, and the first drink of clean water was had either yesterday or two days ago, thereabouts. Now, just given all the content I'm sharing with you, I'm going to be talking about residential school history, the residential school experience, some of the TRC history and history of our center, as well as some of our activities, and then closing out at looking at some of the archival content that we have at the center. So with that, let's get right into things. So up there on screen, I have a photo of the Kamloops Residential School, which you may have heard in the news most recently starting from May. It was one of the larger schools in Canada, and at its peak had over 500 students living there in the 1950s. Now, the residential school system was a network of boarding schools primarily for First Nations children, but these schools also took in Inuit and Métis children. Now, the schools were primarily funded and run by the Christian churches like the Catholic Church and the United Church, but the federal government was also involved in funding and running these schools. Now, just to put something into perspective, I have a photo up there that I just put on from 1933. And in this photo, I counted at least 278 students. So if we were imagined to see a full picture of all 500 students from the 50s, how much larger it would look. My next photo is one you may have seen before. It's on the cover of John Mulroy's book, Story of a National Crime. And it is a before and after picture taken of a young boy named Thomas Moore who attended the Regina Indian Industrial School. Now, the Canadian government said that the role of the residential schools was to civilize and Christianize Indigenous children. And the whole purpose of the system was to remove them from the influence of their community and of their family and culture. Now, when put into practice, those ambitions translate into an attack on Indigenous culture, language, and beliefs. So what to take away from this photo, or this set of photos, is it's posed. It's a propaganda-based piece. If you look on the left-hand side, Thomas is wearing traditional regalia. He's posed in front of what looks like a buffalo robe. And really hinting at this is he's holding a little gun. Now, what I've been told is that that is not Thomas's clothing. That's women's regalia that he's been dressed up in to influence or show the amazing transformation that would happen once children went through the residential school system. So on the right-hand side, we see Thomas's hair is cropped very short. He's wearing a military style uniform, very popular at this time in reformatory schools and industrial schools. And he's posed in front of what looks like a stone balance of some kind. And if you even look at Thomas's face comparatively, they may have overexposed that second photo, as it looks like his face is even brighter than it is in the first one. And again, that really was just to emphasize what would happen to students once they go through the school. Now, my next photo is of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was once the Deputy Superintendent of the Indian Affairs Office and managed the residential schools. Now, one of his famous quotes that he said was, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." So straight from the words of our leaders, we get the intent of what these schools were meant to do. With that, I'm going to touch into some kind of quick key facts about the residential school system before I move into the experience. So the first schools funded by the federal government occurred in 1867 and 1868, so right around Confederation. But by the 1890s, schools switched to a per capita system where the churches would receive a set amount per student within their doors. Now, this, of course, caused schools and denominations to compete with one another to get the most amount of students in order to get the most amount of money to keep that school running. So even if students were in poor health or suffering from disease, they were brought in. Now, another big change came in 1920 when we had the amendment of the Indian Act, which required treaty status children between 7 and 15 to attend a residential school or day school. Now, as enforcement of attendance increased, Indian agents and the RCMP would forcibly remove children from their home, and they could fine the parents up to $2, place them in jail for 10 days, or do both. By 1931, the system was at its peak operation with 80 schools operating at one time. Now, although in the coming decades, the number of schools would decrease, the number of students in attendance actually increased. Another big change came in 1969 when church involvement was drastically reduced when the federal government took over the majority of operations. Now, it's important to take each school's history as its own unique history, as there are cases where we have fully church involvement and engagement in running that school. Then we have a mix of federal government and church involvement. And in other cases, it's church involvement, federal government involvement, and band involvement. Now, you often hear a couple numbers thrown out when the last residential school closed, and there's a couple reasons for this. So the one that you see up there is 1996. That's when the last residence closed. So the last time students lived at the school. But there were some schools still operating as late as 1998, where they did not have residents attached, but were former residential schools. So it's estimated that over 150,000 children attended residential schools, but because of poor record keeping and the loss and destruction of records, that number will truly never be known. So with that, I'm going to move into the experience. So right when students arrived at the schools, they were stripped of their belongings. They were roughly bathed, examined for vermin, doused in chemicals like DDT, and if they did have long braided hair, it was cut. Now, the reason why such an experience was so traumatic is for many Indigenous communities, the only time that they cut their hair was when they were in mourning. So if we can imagine ourselves as little 6-year-old or 7-year-old children, not possibly having that ability to communicate, having the haircut, and then wondering, did my parents suffer something? Did my siblings or extended family? And being put in this traumatic turmoil of not knowing what was going on. Now, if they didn't have a Christian name, one was given to them, and they were also given a number. And this is oftentimes the only name that they were referred to as by, is that personal number. Boys and girls were strictly segregated, as well as siblings, and bells dictated everything from when they woke up to eat, to pray, to clean and sleep. Now, as I mentioned, boys and girls were strictly segregated based upon European norms that were fueled by this perception that Indigenous people were promiscuous. Now, marriages were both prohibited and arranged by the government to establish colonies of former residential school students. And while there was little by way of sexual education, both in and outside schools, the schools cut off the link to that traditional source of knowledge. And so as you see my little slideshow here, there were quite a number of weddings happening at residential schools, as it was seen as a benefit to have two former students marry each other and move to an urban setting or that settler colony, rather than them going back home to their home communities and marrying someone who hadn't been through the residential school system. So this was meant to use and control the family structure. Now, as education institutions, the residential schools were failures and regularly regarded as such. Although students sometimes attended well into their teenage years, it wasn't until after the Second World War that we have more schools begin to offer high school level classes. Now, in the early ages, those classes were very large, between 40 and 50 pupils, even higher in some cases. And that includes students of all age ranges and abilities, as they didn't have specialized institutions to send students who were blind or deaf. Now, schools, they were underfunded and undersupplied. They lacked things like libraries, textbooks, and readers. They lacked schoolyard equipment or sports equipment. Any references to Indigenous peoples in their curriculum was either romanticized and misleading, and religion was seen as the greatest importance, that education from the church. Now, schools up until the 1950s ran on what was known as the half-day system, and this was an unofficial system. And because the schools were really subjected to that underfunding, they had to resort to unpaid labor from the students themselves to keep it going. So in the name of vocational training, students were spending time doing repetitive tasks to support the school. And it was the opinion of certain cabinet ministers that even that was focusing too much time on the academic work rather than the vocational work. Now, work was often very dangerous and it was gendered. So girls were often kept inside doing cooking, cleaning, sewing, and laundry, skills that were supposed to make them good housewives and Christian mothers, while the boys were often outside cutting cordwood, for instance, or maintaining the fields, working with the animals. Sometimes they would do carpentry or cobbling or small engine repair. So many students, they had a difficult time adjusting to a diet that was different from what they were used to at home. Students had little exposure to processed meats, processed cheese, or pasta, and many missed the common foods such as wild meats, fish, bannock, and berries. And for a number of students, eating became a psychological terror. Those who did not eat what was put in front of them were sometimes force-fed. And although staff did not necessarily eat luxury items, many students recalled that they were better fed. And just as an example, students would have porridge, maybe half a cup of milk and bread for breakfast, while the staff might get bacon and eggs. So there was no long-term menu planning. Day-to-day menus lacked variety. They lacked adequacy in quantity and quality. And so it was a very difficult time that forced students to begin to hunt and trap on the sly or even steal from the kitchens. Now, many students have said that sports and the arts was one of the beacons of light. They were able to go out on the rinks or athletic fields or the parade grounds, or even work in arts and handicraft rooms. And so this was a means of escape for them and a way for them to express themselves as well as show off some of the talents they had. And most importantly, they gained confidence. So whenever we're asked the question, wasn't there anything good about residential schools? Was there anything of benefit? It's important to remember that the system was operating for over 150 years, that over 150,000 children went through those doors, and each one is going to have their own unique experience. Some may have a better experience than others, but it's always important to remember that they were removed from home, separated from family, separated from community and their connection to culture. However, for those who were able to get on those sports teams, they found they were better fed, they weren't expected to do heavy chores, and then they would get to leave that residential school to compete against other teams. So there was that form of escapism as well. One of the former commissioners of the TRC said that one of the ways he survived residential school was being on the hockey team, getting to travel, and getting out his aggression on the ice. Now, another piece you may not have heard too much about is the connection to the cadets and Indigenous veterans and the military force in Canada. So the voluntary enlistment of thousands of Indigenous people during the Second World War is a reflection of a number of factors, one of them being the presence of cadet corps in residential schools. Now, the Cadet Corps was a way for a school to get access to resources and funds. And as an example, the Indian Affairs Office attempted to get the War Asset Corporation to provide the Fort Francis School with a full set of band uniforms. However, the commitment to Cadet Corps was drastically reduced after World War II. After 1947, a school needed a qualified instructor, 20 cadets, and then Indian Affairs would then attempt to try and get that exemption for the schools, but they were often denied. Now, cadet activities like musical activities, bands, for instance, as well as arts and sports, was a means for positive press for residential schools. So if you do any sort of searches through newspapers, when you find references to residential schools, that's typically what you're going to find. Now, the overcrowding and underfunding of the residential schools really undermined the health of students right from the get-go. Duncan Campbell Scott in 1913 was quoted as saying, "It's well within the mark to say at least half the amount of children who went to residential school did not live to benefit from the education they received." In 50% of the known cases of causes of death, it's due to tuberculosis, influenza, pneumonia, and general lung disease. But unfortunately, like the question of how many children attended residential school, the number of children who died or were affected will never be known, again, due to poor record keeping and the loss and destruction of records. So one of the statistics you can find is you are more likely to die in a school, 1 in 25 odds, than a soldier fighting in World War II, 1 in 26. And this is based off of statistic of 6,000 children having died, with 150,000 having attended. But if you do a search online, you will find numbers ranging anywhere from 2,000 to as high as 9,000 or more students. Now, the reason why there's such a fluctuation is for the fact if a student became ill at the school, they may be sent to the hospital or sanatorium or even sent back home. And if they died in those locations, their death is not necessarily recorded as having happened at the school, even though they may have caught the illness that eventually killed them at that location. So another piece you may not have often heard of is resistance. So parents, children, communities, they resisted both passively and aggressively. Students stole food, they frustrated authority figures, they fought, they ran away, and they set fires, which is why I have so many fires in this slideshow here. There were 53 major fires at the schools and 170 smaller ones. Now, the other really big risk students took was to run away. And we know cases of students who had died in their attempt, mainly due to succumbing to the elements or drowning. Now, parents, communities, they lobbied for day schools, on-reserve boarding schools, better food, less discipline, more education, and less drudgery. But it's really hit or miss as to whether or not they're successful in those attempts. And that's really based on the time period, region, and that church denomination and the principal or administrator of the school. So with that, that wraps up the experience, and we're now going to move into a little bit of history. So up there on screen, I have a map of the recognized schools under the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. This map is color-coded, representing church denominations, with the most dots of orange representing Catholic schools, yellow Anglican, blue United, and green Presbyterian. But you'll also notice there's some unique colors, like in the Arctic and in Quebec, there is a gray color representing non-denominational schools, which only really began to open from the 1950s and 60s. In Yukon, you'll see a purple circle and white horse representing the only Baptist school in Canada. There are some Mennonite schools in Northwestern Ontario, highlighted in that moss green. And then in Newfoundland and Labrador, those are 5 schools that were operated by the Moravian Mission and Grenfell Association, which are recognized in a separate agreement. Now, there are a couple other circled items I have. The pink ones represent those first schools funded in Canada by the federal government. The green in Nunavut is the last school opened in Canada. It was opened much later than most people think, 1985. And the blue circle you see in Saskatchewan is the last school closed, which was Lebret in 1998. Now, just for context with that recent news in BC, you'll notice I have a gray circled one. That's the Kamloops school where 250 unmarked graves were identified. Now, just to put things into more perspective, there were over 1,500 plus institutions put forward for recognition, but only 144 are recognized. So these are the top reasons why an institution was excluded: that it was run by the province or territory alone, that there wasn't enough information, or that it was a day school. Now, to be added, an institution had to fulfill two pieces of what's known Article 12. A child was removed from home and placed into the institution for education purposes. And number two, that Canada had to be jointly or solely responsible for the operation or care of the child. So if we were now to imagine this map with all of the unrecognized residential schools, day schools, Indian hospitals, and sanatoriums, it would look much different. It would be much more crowded. And so it's important to remember that these colonial systems have had an impact much greater than many of the statistics or maps you see, as you also have to think of the children, grandchildren, and those other intergenerational survivors. So before I move on to some contemporary history, just as a note, there are 4 other class action lawsuits in various states. For instance, there's the 60 Scoop class action lawsuit to talk about and deal with the legacy of students or children removed from their homes between 1950 and 1990 and adopted out or placed in non-Indigenous homes. There is a class action lawsuit for the federal Indian day schools. There are 699 recognized day schools across Canada. There is a settlement agreement for the scholars or the day school scholars of residential schools, for those who did not live at the school but still attended there. And lastly, there is a class action lawsuit specifically for those who experienced mistreatment at Indian hospitals and sanatoriums. And so this one is the most recent one that was ratified this past January 2020. Now, with that, I'm going to move into some contemporary history. So in 1986, this is the year we received the first apology from a church, the United Church, after activist Alberta Billy addressed the United Church Executive Council in 1981 for an apology. In 1990, then Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Phil Fontaine, spoke about his experience at the Fort Alexander School and reported on a meeting he had with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese where he described the abuses suffered and demanded an inquiry. 10 years later, by 2001, we had over 8,500 lawsuits filed about abuses suffered in the schools. And just 4 years later, we had 18,000 lawsuits filed. 2005 is also the year we had the Blackwater versus Plank Supreme Court case, which delivered its judgment in favor of the Blackwater plaintiffs, setting a precedent for similar cases where they acknowledged the abuses suffered in British Columbia residential schools and stated that those survivors were able to receive compensation. So this led directly to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. So negotiations for this agreement were approved in 2006, which stated that harms and abuses were committed against many Indigenous children who attended the schools. And so this agreement was formed to establish a fair, comprehensive, and lasting resolution to this legacy, while also promoting healing, education, commemoration, and truth and reconciliation. Now, just for time, I'm able to go in depth into every one of these pieces related to the settlement agreement, but I'll just quickly touch on each one, starting with the independent assessment process, an out-of-court adjudication process for claims of serious sexual and physical abuse and other wrongful acts. At the top is the common experience payment, a lump sum compensation payment for the loss of culture, language, family, and forced assimilation. There were funds set aside for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation to distribute to community-based healing initiatives to promote reconciliation. When those funds were all distributed, they closed their doors. Next, for healing and commemoration, there is the 24-hour crisis line, which still exists today, as well as the Resolution Health Support Program to support survivors and their families. There was also funds set aside for commemoration initiatives. Now, as you can see, branching off, there is also the TRC, which then leads to the NCTR. So for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was founded in 2008 as a holistic and comprehensive response to residential schools. It's the first court-ordered truth commission of its kind established in Canada. And in 2008, they appointed 3 commissioners who resigned shortly thereafter. And then 3 new commissioners were appointed in 2009, which you see pictured there: the Honorable Marie Sinclair, Dr. Marie Wilson, and Chief Wilton Littlechild. So they had exactly 1 year to plan the first national event, which was followed up by 6 other national events and then a closing ceremonies in Ottawa in June of 2015, where they released the 94 calls to action. Now, again, just due to time, I won't go into depth into the TRC mandate, but I'll touch on each one of these pieces. The first being commemoration, with grants being available to honor, educate, and remember and pay tribute to survivors and families. There were regional liaison offices to coordinate TRC activities. There was the Missing Children and Unmarked Burial Project, as well as funds set aside for community events. There were also those 7 national events held across Canada to promote awareness in public education. And the 3 that most closely relate to our center is the statement gathering, which was an in-person process where former students, families, and staff could come and give their statements to the TRC. There was also the collection of documents from the government and churches, which then all accumulate into the TRC's final report. They say it's 6 volumes, it's actually 10 books, and it covers quite a lot of material from the history to the Métis and Inuit experience to unmarked burials to the legacy and reconciliation. And if you're looking to access any one of these volumes, they are available for free on our website. Now, in 2012, the settlement agreement mandated that the commission create a permanent home for all of the materials they had collected. And in 2012, they opened up a bidding process. Now, after that lengthy review process, custodianship of the archives was given to the University of Manitoba. And on National Indigenous Peoples Day in 2013, the trust agreement and administrative agreement were signed between the University of Manitoba and the TRC. Now, in 2014, our first director was appointed, Ryan Moran, and later that year, renovations began on our current home, Chancellor's Hall, although there are now plans in place where we just broke ground on our future home placement at the University of Manitoba. Now, as for our own mandate, we have 5 main pieces to it. So as this permanent home, we are here first and foremost for survivors and their families so that they can get access to their history. We are also here to ensure educators can share the history in the classroom, that researchers can delve deeper into the mysteries that exist. And just as a very good example, if you have the time, do a quick search for the historian Ian Mosby. In 2013, he published an article about nutritional experiments that were done at residential schools in the 1940s and 50s. Now, the last 2 are so closely related, the public and the history. It's to ensure that this material helps foster reconciliation and healing, and that the history is never forgotten. Now, at the center, we have 3 main units. We have the archive unit, the research unit, and then education. For archives, it's ensuring people have access to church, government, and survivor records, that they honor and safeguard this history, that we continue to accession and bring in new documents, as well as support research. Under the research unit, they're there to promote and advance research, support undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as to help establish and develop relationships. And finally, in education, we're here to provide access to resources, partner with organizations to develop new resources, support educators, as well as engage the public about residential schools and the legacy. We are guided by 2 groups at the NCTR, our Governing Circle and Survivor Circle. The Governing Circle provides guidance on the center's policies, priorities, activities, on our ceremonies, on our methods and sources for expansion. Now, our Survivor Circle is currently composed of 9 members, but we're going to be expanding. And so the Survivor Circle is tasked to ensure that there's a survivor voice at the center of our programs and policies. So the Survivor Circle, they provide guidance to our center, to the Governing Circle, to the university and our partners, as well as for those who are in need of that broader survivor community perspective. We have a staff that is over 70% Indigenous, that's over 50% female, and staff at our center have gone on to work for the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry at the UBC Dialogue Center, in public service, as well as in their own home communities. And so we're a mixture of survivors, intergenerational survivors, First Nations, Métis, non-Indigenous, and newcomers. Now, as for engagements, We get requests from all across the board, and we provide presentations and workshops, as well as professional development. We do over 100 presentations per year on a variety of topics, including what you're hearing today. So that history and experience of schools, the settlement agreements, the TRC and the NCTR, our collection of records, but we also share information about other colonial systems and their impacts, intergenerational trauma and healing, as well as the Student Memorial Register and getting engaged with the calls to action. We've also had a number of international guests visiting our center since 2016, with the first being the House of Memory Museum from Colombia. We've also had a delegation from the Ivory Coast, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, a very similar organization to us, which works with survivors from the residential schools or boarding schools in the United States. We've also had the Malin Truth and Reconciliation Commission visit us, and the Subcommittee on Reconciliation from Taiwan's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, as well as visitors from East Timor from the Centro Nacional Chega. And most recently, a German delegation came to visit our center. Actually, I have to adjust that. It was 2021, not 2020. So I'm going to share a little bit of some of the activities at our center before I move into looking at some documents. So one of the activities we have is the Imagine a Canada program, where we ask students from kindergarten to grade 12 and CEGEP to submit both art pieces and project plans of how they envision Canada to be reconciled. So we have worked with over 200 schools, over 1,000 projects, and tens of thousands of students. And this year, we're going to be relaunching the program on September 30th, where students submitting project plans from grade 6 to 12 have a chance to obtain a micro grant to turn their vision into a reality. And so these are just a few photos from our previous years. And so I say, stay tuned and visit our website if you'd like to learn more about Imagine Canada. We also have our NCTR dialogue series, where we invite experts and special guests to talk about a variety of topics. And here's just a list of some of the dialogues we've had, where we posted them on Facebook Live and then transferred them over to YouTube. So you can find information about the LGBTQ and Two-Spirit perspective on the calls to action, youth perspectives on the calls for action, the education calls for action, living the good life in Two-Spirit communities, how we can support our urban Inuit families, as well as touching on survivor and academic perspectives on unmarked graves. Now, the other one that I'm going to highlight is the Decolonizing Lens. It's a free film series we host each year, where we invite guests from experts to academics to activists to those involved in a film production to share their experience. We've had over 30 events, 83 films, and 85 guests. And here's a photo from our 2019 event at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, where we paired with the Give Me Some Truth Festival and the National Film Board to screen Freedom Road, which is about Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and the road that was recently built. Now, as for our publications, the most popular one is our little orange booklets that you see on the right. Those contain the 94 calls to action, 10 principles of reconciliation, and the 46 articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We've distributed over 300,000 of those booklets. Now, our other publications come for our perspectives of reconciliation series, starting with A Knock on the Door, followed up by Pathways for Reconciliation. And the most recent three are ones related to decolonizing discipline, the Assiniboia Residential School here in Winnipeg, and most recently, the legacy of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, all of which could be purchased from U of M Press. Now, our biggest education initiative is our work through Every Child Matters Education, or Reconciliation Through Education, a one-day program we had last year with over 5,000 individuals, 500,000 teachers and students participate. This year, we've expanded to an entire week of program, September 27th to October 1st. This is for students from grade 5 to grade 12, but we also have opened it to the general public. So we are releasing content every single day of the week. You do not have to attend the live sessions. all of the content is going to be uploaded to the YouTube page, and we already have over 600,000 individuals, educators, students, and the general public ready and registered for this upcoming week. So you can find more about Truth and Reconciliation Week by actually just typing that in a Google or browser search, and you will likely pull up that registration page, and you can also find more on our website. Now, the last one I will touch on is our Namikwanemak, or I Remember Them Fund. So this is our community commemoration fund that is now available for those to support commemoration initiatives around residential schools. So we are providing funds for remembrance for community-led healing gatherings, ceremonial activities, as well as memorial or commemorative markers and the maintenance of burial sites. So application is on a rolling basis with up to $7,500 available for each activity. So more information about the Community Support Fund can be found on our website. So we're now going to touch on missing children and unmarked burials. So in 2007, a working group was established to answer the 4 questions you see on screen. First, how many children died and who were they? The second, what did those children die of? The third, where are those children buried? And the fourth, who were the children who went missing? Now, during the TRC's mandate, they were able to identify over 3,672 students, both named and unnamed. Now, since the start of this working group and since the TRC closed that door, we have added 477 new names to that list. So we have confirmed at least 4,118 students named and unnamed who died at residential school. In September of 2019, we held a special ceremony at the Museum of History where we created a large red banner with all the names of the students who died at residential school and then launched what's now known as the Student Memorial Register. So on our website, you can now access and find the names of all the students we have identified, with our project goals being to create profiles for each one of those students to identify who they are, where they came from, where they belong, as well as to respect families and communities, as well as to bring an Indigenous perspective to remembrance and the right. So the right to justice, the right to reparations, the right to know the truth, and the right that this never happens again. Now, here's a very quick breakdown of 20 schools with the highest casualty numbers. Those 20 schools account for 50% of the known deaths at residential schools, with the other 49% covering 88 schools. So there are 7 schools in Saskatchewan, which account for 487 deaths, 5 in Alberta, 2 in BC, 3 in Ontario, 2 in the northern regions, and 1 in Manitoba. And so this accounts for at least 1,332 deaths of the named students. Now, when it comes to the Missing Children Project, we are continuing work. We have so far investigated all incomplete cases of lost children in the TRC's research. We've validated most cases and eliminated incorrect records. We've created a register with 15 fields of information and created that commemorative website. So phase 2, we are now investigating records the TRC did not have time for. There are 98 record sets from government and churches that haven't been researched. And when this is complete, we can say we have researched all of the records that have been provided to us from the TRC. But of course, this is only schools recognized under the settlement agreement. This does not include unrecognized schools. Now, here is a quick panoramic view of what a very good looking cemetery site looks like. This is from the Shingwauk Residential School, which is now home to Algoma University. So first off, they're using stone grave markers. Most sites have only wooden grave markers. This also has an active survivor society and alumni association that takes care of this site. You'll see there are borders to identify the boundaries. They have a little memorial cairn erected as well as a memorial bench. But most often, this is what a residential school cemetery looks like. In this case, from Brandon, they do have a border around it and a memorial cairn erected, but most times it is just an empty field. Now, one of our primary concerns with the NCTR was ensuring survivor access. So we have received over 895 requests since opening our doors and over 272 requests starting from May this year alone. Oftentimes, we are reaching thereabouts a little less than 200 or so requests per year. But with the talk and discussion of unmarked burials, we have seen an increase in requests. So at the center, we have to engage in a balancing act to be open and transparent, as well as to be accountable and fulfilling our mandates. So supporting access and protecting privacy. And so we have to walk this very fine line to ensure that we don't cause more harm than good by releasing information. So within our records, in our archive, we have government records, survivor records, church records. We really have everything under the sun, from admissions and discharge to hospital records, transportation records, police files, student records, photographs, newsletters, cemetery records, religious records, statements, and over 2,500 physical objects. So if you go to our database right now, you can gain access to 58,000 items of our 5 million collection and growing. Over 36,000 documents, over 18,000 photos, and over 329 videos. That includes statements from survivors as well as mini documentaries. So if you go to nctr.ca, this is the website that you're going to get access for more information. The best way to navigate is actually to scroll down to the very bottom, where you get a full breakdown of each one of the sections and what's contained therein. Now, if you're wanting to access the archives directly, the best address to go to is archives.nctr.ca. So this is the main landing page. And if you search for schools, for instance, it's going to pull up the 168 schools we have documents for. And you can find on the left-hand side ways that you can search this document guide. And so in this case, I clicked on the Maryvale Residential School. And so this is Maryvale's webpage. On the left-hand side, you can see you have access to 123 specific records. Now, that's not the total collection from this school, only what we've provided access to the public so far. So if you scroll down a little bit, you'll get the biographical information about the school, other names, descriptions, access points, and a really good document to use on the left-hand side is that school narrative. That is preliminary research done for the settlement agreement about the specific school and contains a whole host of information that's very useful. Some really good search terms you can use include quarterly returns. So this was a financial document used in the schools. You can also search general administration records. Those contain a whole host of unique information. You can also search up death or death of pupil if you're wanting to find more information about particular cases, or vocational or training. You can also search for medical supplies, accounts or payments, building or maintenance, lands, maps or blueprints, yearbook or newsletter, letters, memos, and reports. And so this is just a small subsection of some of the things that you can find. So that wraps up all of my history portion. I'm now going to show you some of those records I've been talking about that you can access. So the first of which is this handwritten letter. So this comes from 1937, and it was slipped to an Indian agent from a student at the Shetlet Residential School in BC. So I recognize it is a little hard to read. I'm going to read the transcript I have. And it says, "I'm writing a few lines to let you know that things are going on in this school. I wonder if the chiefs could do something about it. We're not allowed to talk to our parents or any of those who are in the village. We are not even allowed to smile or say hello at them. The school is not a school at all. It is a jailhouse. Now it is more than a jail. And the food is pig's food. It is not fit for human beings to eat. Some stone apple cores, rotten spuds and worms, rotten meats, and they force us to eat it. That's why some boys get sick. They don't like to eat it. That's all I was going to say." And that's kind of crossed out. So he says, "I can say some more, but that's all I can tell you, Arthur Jeffries." So one question we often get asked for, weren't there investigations into the schools regarding maltreatment? And there were. And so in this case, there are investigations that do occur where the investigator from Indian Affairs could interview staff, look at menus, purchase ledgers, the kitchen and storage facility, as well as the food service area. Now, when possible, they might also eat with the students. They could visit the reserve to talk to parents, or even look at the reports from this document here, the Canadian Food Guide Rules. So this one comes from 1944. It's the official food guide rules. And the ones that I'm just going to highlight for you is the amount of milk that children need, 1.5 pints to 1 quart, so 3 to 4 cups of milk per day. So the next piece I'm going to show is related to some records from the school. And so this is where there are some links that I'm going to highlight just for you to know where you can access and see those documents firsthand. So one of the menus that we're going to look like comes from this school here, All Saints Residential School in Aklavik, Northwest Territories. It was open from 1936 to 1959. And the second set menu that we're going to look at is from Mount Elgin Mount Elgin Residential School located in Ontario, which is open from 1867 to 1946. So just for legibility, I transcribed and highlighted Monday's menu about the Aklavik Residential School. So this one you can find from the link that's labeled R00009017, and you can find the menu specifically on pages 8 and 9. So as you can see, this menu is not looking so good. The student is getting 1,183 calories. Where they're getting the most amount of nutrition is the boiled fish and the boiled eggs. But it's important to recognize that a 6-year-old child needs between 12,000 or 14,000 calories per day. And an older child needs 16,000 to 26,000 calories per day. So this is not feeding the youngest children in the school, which is at 6 years old. And it's certainly not feeding the older children at 16 years old. It's empty calories, carbohydrates, and sugar. And if you look at the pictures, they're not looking so good either. Now, on the flip side, we're going to look at the Mount Elgin menu. So this record you can access by the document link that's labeled R00009514, and this is found on page 18. So already we're looking, it's a couple hundred more calories more than that previous menu, 1,452 calories. And if we think about what we might want to see out of boarding school foods, we're seeing much better selection. We're seeing colors, red, greens, yellows. We are seeing vegetables, fruits, things like meat and gravy, potatoes, bread and butter on whole milk. So automatically we're thinking sounds like a much better menu than what those other students are getting. But the question I want you to take from this is both of these menus come from investigations into the school of children not being properly fed. And so based upon all of the information you have about residential schools, which menu would you believe is a more accurate representation of what's actually being served in residential schools, and which one might be a little bit of a fib as to what's going on? And so right off the hop, I'll tell you the menu that comes from this one, Aklavik, is the more accurate one. And I'm going to show you the documents and walk you through why that one is a more accurate and reliable menu. So this specific document, Letter of School Conditions, is from the link that says R00009017, and you can find this from pages 3 to 7. And so I'm going to show you each one of these pages. So you see this letter comes from March 13th, 1944. It's written to the Honorable Ian Sinclair, who was in the Department of Pensions and National Health. And so a teacher named Eden Corlett writes, "I wish to call your attention to 3 factors that concern the welfare of Eskimo and Indian children at this school." She says, "From the very beginning, I was appalled at the health conditions here and set about an exercise to influence by making the subject of health a prominent topic." She further says, "Progress was stunted as those in charge of the children did not seem to consider hygienic conditions as part of their welfare. I will enumerate the conditions as I've witnessed, totally unexaggerated, most of which have been observed today." So she first states that the drinking pail and the cups to serve students was dirty and lying on the floor, and that it was very difficult to find that pail or jug. Furthermore, number 3 that I really want to highlight, she says, "The toilets are smelly with insufficient disinfectant for cleaning and no toilet paper. No paper of any kind is ever provided." And you can see some of the quality of the documents we receive at the center of this was scanned directly to us. And so we were unable to actually be there in person to unfurl this document. So we had to do a little bit of creative reading in that case. But she says, "At Christmas, I saw children tearing up their paint books in an effort to be clean. The fourth concern is wash bowls, soap, and towels have completely disappeared. The fifth being toothbrushes, which were given out at the beginning of the year, have vanished. Never has there been dentifrice or toothpaste been given to the children. No wonder there are large dentist bills with no attempt made to preserve their teeth. And I tell you, if you do a search for dentists and dentist bills in our archive, you will find long lists of students having tonsils removed, extractions and fillings, and not so much a focus on the preventative measures as you see Eden mentioned here. She also has a handwritten note added because she sent this letter twice. She sent this in 1943 when she wasn't believed, and then before she left, she sent it in 1944. So she did add a note saying that the doctor stopped by to provide dentifrice or toothpaste and toothbrushes for the students. She said handkerchiefs are never provided. Sleep is a problem depending on who's on duty. Clothes could be described as floor mats, and destruction of property is due to non-supervision. But the piece I really want to highlight is related to the food, because you're not going to believe this. She says, I enclose in this menu, the exact contents of which I ate myself for 1 week in August to ascertain whether or not it was sufficient. I can truthfully say I was hungry. Of the $100 allotted to the government for each child, only $20.52 is spent on food per year, compared to $162.19 for each staff member. And she says here, that's a fact I can prove. I studied the invoices, checked off the food allotted. And so let's take a look at conversion rates. So how much is $20.52 worth today? That's $308.70 for the whole year. And when we divide that out, that's $25.73 per month on food. Just think about what you might be able to buy with that amount of money. Now, as for those teachers, $162.19 is about $2,439.98, which is around $203 per month on food. So you can definitely buy a little more than you could with that $25. So just following along with that, she says the essential products of milk, butter, eggs, and cheese are denied. Her third concern is related to fire. And as I had mentioned, over 53 major fires at residential schools. So she says the commission now has been exceedingly nervous in the question about fire due to recent losses, but they haven't taken the trouble to install a proper fire alarm. And although I won't be spending so much time on this, she says that they evaded the issue and said that there is a temporary alarm constructed, and it's temporary, all right. It's completely disabled and has been for months. And even when it did work, it couldn't be heard throughout the building, as cited by the experience of one staff member who continued to work in her room during a fire drill, not having known there had been even a fire drill. So her last concern was about the quality of education, but here she says, I'm not asking you to accept these facts without verification, but for the sake of the children, send your government representative here to be authorized to enter the building and ascertain the facts. She says, every one of these facts I disclosed to the commission last year, but after repeated failure to get cooperation, they have taken an attitude of complacency and apathy, and the commission refuses to believe these conditions exist. So she says, one hears constant criticism from the outsiders, of course, that the advisability of these residential schools is poor. Definitely, she says, it's the only way we can educate the children, but I consider the system as it is now does not meet their requirements. She says, how can a child after 4 or 10 years in a school supposed to adapt itself to the environment of its parents when the language habits have been severed? The child is an alien and the situation pitiful. And she says, is that practical Christianity? It's a strong indictment of my own church, but I've yet to see how this is going to work, how segregation from all family bonds where language, customs, and arts are not fostered can be called practicing Christianity. So she says, she ends her letter here, I've taught many races, European and white, and I know these children are brilliant. Given a chance, they could become doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers, or enter any traded profession they choose. We have 2 great native races in this country, but so much of their art and potentialities are being lost because of men who take only cursory glances and administer from far off fields. Why doesn't someone take a tangible interest in furthering the welfare of these races, which Canada should be justly proud? So quite a strong indictment here, right? And again, we're often asked, weren't there any good teachers at residential school? Didn't anyone try to help these children? And as you can see, there were instances where there were those who really were looking out for the health and welfare of the students. Unfortunately, they are up against such a system that they really are unable to make any changes. So after Ms. Eden submitted her letter, there was an investigation into the school. Dr. L.D. Livingston visited the school, and he confers with what Ms. Eden has said. Firstly, that the most undesirable factor is the construction of the building itself. They have the laundry in the basement, and they don't have a long enough year for the building to thaw. Additionally, he says that as for the sanitary conditions like the drinking water, washing facilities, and toilets, they are, as she says they are, and no doubt is due to carelessness in supervision. Just for time, I'm jumping one page and I'm going to focus on the fact that he says that the milk supplied is not sufficient and hasn't been mixed to the proper strength. There's little cheese and no butter supply. So the essentials of fruit, milk, cheese, and butter are very important and should be increased. He also states that the escape chutes or the fire escapes in the school with the proper fire drill is probably sufficient at this time. And in fact, they have a working fire engine, so not to worry if there is any fires at the school. But the biggest takeaway is his final lines here. He says, in my care of medical staff at the Anglican school, much of my work is dedicated to the female staff. A great deal of trouble is due to neuroses, caused no doubt to the environment and diet. I suggest the period of 4 years be cut down. 2 years is long enough for any girl. So the biggest takeaway is to adjust the number of years missionaries spend at the school. Instead of 4, it should only be 2. Now, just as a background, who was Eden Corlett? She was actually a very interesting woman. I was able to pull quite a bit of information based upon my own newspaper research. She was born in 1914 from immigrant parents who've moved to the Alberta area. And as she grew up, she got her teaching education and taught in a number of places, including, as you can see, as a missionary at the Aklavik Residential School. So she accepted the position in 1942. Now, unfortunately, her father passed away in 1943, so she was forced to return home to Edmonton. When she returned home, she got her BA from the University of Alberta and was also studying at the University of Toronto for postgraduate work. She traveled extensively through the Middle East as well as through Europe. And she was a member and later president of the Zonata Club, which was an international women's service organization. So she wrote for the newspaper and provided guidance to the Edmonton School Board on a psychologist's view of student health. So with all that information we just walked through, that is one of the reasons why I believe Miss Eden's letter is being a more authentic representation of what's being served in the residential schools. And my last 2 or 3 slides, I'm going to talk about that other menu and where it comes from and why we are unable to put our trust in it as much as this first letter. So it comes from Mount Elgin, as I had mentioned, from 1936. And it comes from an investigation in the school after a fellow by the name of George Dolson went to visit his daughter, Mary Ethel Dolson, and found that at her lunchtime, she wasn't given enough food. So he visited her and said that she had bread, but no butter, no meat, that she had 4 small potatoes, diced carrots, and a butterscotch pudding. And he believed that he could feed her better at home. So with that, the Indian agent asked Dr. McLeod to go with him to the school to investigate. And so in the presence of the doctor, the principal, the matron, and the dietitian, Mary Ethel Dolson gave her statement. However, the dietitian said that the students get meat at least twice a week. And so she considered that enough according to calories and believed that the pupils were getting a well-balanced diet. The father, however, could not be convinced that his child was getting good enough meals. And so rather than to have further trouble, they let George Dolson take his daughter home. In fact, they say that there is a wait list for this residential school and they could easily fill it with another pupil. They also state, however, that there's been a large number of students who've run away from the school. And the RCMP has stated that a number of these runaways had been picked up, and the complaints that they had was that they weren't getting enough food. They were being made to eat food that was not accustomed to. However, their belief was that the complaints of children can be understood to some extent, but in the big takeaway from this is when they did a survey of the school concerning the health conditions, when they spoke to the principal, that dietitian, and the matron, they believed what was actually happening, where students were stealing from the food and keeping the food either for themselves or giving them to their friends. And so rather, this is a challenge of supervision, not the fact that the school is not actually feeding these students. And if you get a chance to take a look at that specific record, and there are all links to all how you can access all of these records, you will find that this menu is actually labeled specimen copy of menu. It is not even confirmed that this is the menu that the students were being fed for that time. And based upon the complaints that we have from George, as well as his daughter, Mary Ethel, we can believe that in likelihood that menu is either a forgery or a means to actually circumvent any sort of trouble in this investigation, not the actual food being served. So with that, I see I'm just a four minutes over the 1 hour mark, and I'm going to conclude my presentation here. With that, I have a final slide with some contact means. So if you want to access our NCTR website, it's nctr.ca. To access the archives, archives.nctr.ca. And for any questions for anything on the material I presented on, you can email nctr@umanitoba.ca, and that email will go to the right department. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and we'll see about some questions.
Thank you so much, Kaila. I'd like to start by saying to our viewers that and to you as well, there's a little bit of a lag, as you probably know, between our presentation and what people are actually seeing on YouTube. So it might take them a few seconds to get their questions up. But while we're waiting for that, I wanted to say, from my perspective, I know that was incredibly difficult to hear. It was important to hear, but very difficult. And I can only imagine what it must be like for you to go to work every day and have to hear those stories. I imagine it's incredibly challenging as an intergenerational survivor, as you said. But thank you so much for your work. I hope it's rewarding, but I'm sure it's very difficult. So thank you for that. I did. I noted down a couple of questions that I had myself, so maybe just while we're waiting for people to post them as well. So I'm sorry if I missed this. When you were talking about the reasons that a school might be excluded from sort of the list of official residential schools, one of them was hospitals, and I didn't quite understand what was meant by that. Could you explain that again, please?
Of course. So that is talking most likely about those who submitted for that inclusion is either an Indian hospital or sanatorium, much like Charles Campbell in Edmonton, one of the largest of these specific institutions. For those sanatoriums, they were specific for the treatment of tuberculosis, but Indian hospitals, they would treat tuberculosis or any other sort of general health. And so both were racially segregated institutions for the treatment of Indigenous peoples. And so for the reason why those would be excluded is that individual or patient was there for medical purposes. Although they would have had teachers as well as classrooms for the children there, that purpose wasn't for education, it was for the treatment of an ailment. So that's why those would be excluded.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you. And then, sorry, I'm sorting through my notes because lots of the things I was writing down were sort of for example, Ian Mosby, the author you mentioned, sort of notes to myself to look up later. But one of the other ones I wrote down, you said specifically that there were 20 schools that represented approximately 50% of the known childhood deaths. What was it specifically? Do we know what it was about those schools that made them so particularly bad? Was it partly their size? Because they seem to be scattered across the country.
No, you're the first person to ever ask me such a specific question. And what I'll let you know is that we've only just begun research. So I'm unable to specifically say why those schools in particular had a higher number of casualties associated with them. I would have to take a look at my full list again. I know the majority of students taken to residential school and the majority of residential schools you can find in the prairie provinces, but there are also some more infamously known schools to be aware of. For instance, Cooper Island on Vancouver Island is known as a particularly violent school there with a high number, and they're one of the schools accounted for in this top 20 list. But then there are others where we're still discovering information because of that lack of record keeping, the poor records and such. The total number for each school will likely never be known. And where was I going with this? Just as an example, the Maryvale School, for instance, we only have about 8 students recorded as having died at that school. But as you'll know from the news from Cowessus, they had identified 751 unmarked burials. I will note for that specifically, that the school cemetery site and the community cemetery were next to each other. So whether or not that's actually 750 students, we don't know because of that difference in the number that we have in the records. So the next phase, we're in this very phase 1 stage of identifying these sites, but phase 2 is working with those communities and discussing what they would like to see happen, whether or not they're interested in things like exhumation, for instance, or whether or not we're going to keep things as they are and simply erect a memorial for that. So more research has to be done into those specific schools. More research has to be done in community and with survivors and those who contain information we can't find in records, which is one of the important pieces about our center is we both have statements from survivors and their families, that oral history. And we know abusers don't create records of abuse. So we also have those documents from the government and churches, but those aren't necessarily outlining the specific negative things that have happened there necessarily. So it's having both creates a fuller picture, but again, that full truth is just not going to be able to be pulled together. We can do our best, but there will always be unanswered questions.
Right, of course. Thank you. And so, sort of on that note, I know a lot of our listeners, a lot of our followers are very supportive of us. But is there a way that if they choose to, they can support the NCTR as well? Is there a donation process, that sort of thing, to help you further this work?
There is, and you can find more if you visit our website, nctr.ca. In the top right-hand corner beside the English and French, you'll see a donate button. If you click that, you'll get information on some of the specific projects that can be funded, such as the I Will Remember Them Fund. You can also fund some of our education initiatives, or there is the option if you just simply want to donate to the NCTR in general, that you can just do a general donation.
Excellent, thank you. So I don't see any other questions popping up just now. So I'm going to say again, thank you so much. As I said a minute ago, this is an incredibly important topic for us to hear, and it's really eye-opening for many of us. So thank you very much for your work, and I'm going to turn it back over to Tom.
And you think you were out of here, but maybe I'm going to have a couple of questions. Chris was on a roll there. So this network of residential schools, how encompassing was it? Were there communities that were just out of reach of kind of the area of influence of one of these schools, or did every community, was it impacted and their children drawn into the system?
I would say, no doubt, there are some remote communities that may have escaped the influence of residential schools and had children taken away. One slide I didn't show and just didn't have the time to touch on is a snapshot into the 1948 school year from July, August, and September. And in that slide, I was able to document 520 unique communities across Canada that had children removed, but that's the lowest base estimate. There were 75 schools operating. We only have records for 65 of those schools, and some schools did not record where students came from or used very archaic means to record that information. But I can say at the very least, there were 520 communities affected. And as I had mentioned, also, the age of children in the schools was supposed to be between 7 and 15. But in that school year, I found children as young as 2 and as old as 20 in those schools. So when it comes to those statistics, when it comes to this information, we have to take it in good faith that that information is accurate, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes they were hiding information on there. Sometimes they weren't filling it all in. So there's always going to be those little blank spots. But no doubt there were some communities that weren't reachable, that they couldn't get children from them placed in those schools.
All right, one final one, and then we really will let you go. So as I understand it, truth and reconciliation, part of that is educating the likes of us, non-Indigenous people. So we can donate. I know I made a personal donation, and I want our audience to know, rather than you taking an honorarium, we're going to make a donation on behalf of our organization to the NCTR. What else can people do, like to get involved, to learn, to share the information and resources?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I have a lot of tips and tricks when it comes to this. So the first one being, if you were missed out on this education in your K-12 or graduate studies, check out the University of Alberta's MOOC course, Indigenous Canada. It's completely for free. It's a 12-week module program that touches on worldviews, history, challenges, and the current status of Indigenous peoples in Canada today from an Indigenous perspective. In addition to that, we always recommend people to stay up to date with recent news items, to learn more about Wet'suwet'en land rights, about Mi'kmaq treaty rights, about racism in the healthcare system, or, for instance, racism in sport. For instance, the Edmonton Eskimos dropped that moniker, and this year they are playing as the Edmonton Elks. And we're seeing many, many sports teams now dropping these racist pieces to those histories and adopting more acceptable names. Additionally, you can take a look at great guiding documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, like the TRC's calls to action, or even the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report and their 231 calls for justice. There are some really great websites out there which touch upon the territories that you live in, whether you're on ceded or unceded land, which treaty or language group. So you can learn about territorial acknowledgements and how to say the correct names for Indigenous communities local to you. In addition to that, you can follow, listen, Indigenous activists and academics, individuals like Pam Palmader or Negan Sinclair, or our young folks like Autumn Pelche, who's a water warrior and someone that many people look up to today for the protection of the water. In addition to that, you can buy from Indigenous suppliers. You can go and attend events or screenings or exhibits held for Indigenous communities or by Indigenous communities. You can also reach out to members of parliament, senators, or other individuals and places that can enact real change and support private members' bill, like most recently the passing of Bill C-5, which is related to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation this September 30th. Consider, what are you doing for September 30th? This is a day to formally recognize and acknowledge survivors and the fights that they have gone through and the traumas that they have experienced. It's going to be similar to our Remembrance Day, a day for reflection and a day to consider, what are you doing for reconciliation? And so, as I mentioned, if you want, you can visit our YouTube page, watch some of that Truth and Reconciliation Week content. But there also are a number of really great documents out there related to allyship, like Lingehell's allyship or Bill of Ooh, Bill of Responsibilities for Allies, I believe it's called. There's also the Montreal Network's own pamphlet on what it means to be a good ally. But you can also, as I said, just really focus on learning and get yourself more aware of some of the issues and challenges that exist here in Canada, and consider what it means to support those communities or organizations that are supporting our survivors and those impacted by these colonial systems.
Wow. Thank you. So, and if I can add one for our audience or anyone that comes along and watch the archive recording, then share the link with other people in your network and in your communities. I know we got some educators that will treat this as a resource. So help get the word out. And Kaila, thank you so much. You're a tremendous advocate, a great spokesperson. We really appreciate you sharing this content with us and taking this time on a Saturday afternoon and interacting with our audience. We very, very much appreciate it. So thank you so much.